Next curve.
Hi, everyone. This is Leonard Lee, executive analyst at neXt. And wow, I'm back from Barcelona. And what are we, like 2 weeks out? 2 weeks out from the event. So yeah, this is a little bit of a late recap here, but I am joined by some of my best friends in the analyst world. Okay, starting off with Prakash Sangam, who is the president and lead principal executive analyst.
All in one, man.
Yeah, exactly. At Tantra analyst. And then we also have Earl Lum of EJL Wireless Research, who is, as we had well established in Barcelona, this gentleman is a criminal.
Because, again, white collar only, not blue.
Yes, because no one should know as much about RAN as this guy. So welcome. And we're going to be doing a recap of MWC 2023 and what Prakash and I and Earl are going to do. We're going to share our takes. Key takes from the event this year. I think it was a pivotal year, quite honestly. I think it was a very important one because I think we can say it's been the first year where we've really made our way out of the sort of the pandemic malaise and constraints. And we're looking at some really interesting dynamics, especially as now all eyes are set on 5G Advanced, right? So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to go around and maybe have you guys just share what were some of the key takes that you thought really surfaced to the top. I mean, it was a huge event. I had a chance to talk to John Hoffman, who is the CEO of GSMA, and he said that there were something like 88,000 attendees at this year's event, which is almost up there back to the pre-pandemic level. So it was a pretty big event. I mean, what did you guys think? What were the general impressions of the event itself?
All right, I'll go.
Okay, go ahead.
I think a couple of key things. You mentioned 5.5G. So certainly Huawei and ZTE had product and talked about it in their presentations.
Yeah.
No one else really did, at least to my knowledge, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Also, everything was about deep sleep, or essentially 0-bit, 0-watt on the radio. And transparent antennas or integrated passive active antennas was the other key theme, in addition to just multi-band everything across the board, at least on the RAN side.
Okay, I'll give a little bit more higher overview from my point of view. I think there was no main theme, like dominant theme in the event. There are a lot of specific important topics, I would say. And there was no hype, which was good. So for me, Open RAN, I think, a lot of, everybody had a presence, and then it is becoming kind of more real than what hype it was some time ago. Private networks, I mean, people were on the ground talking about actual deployments other than this huge hype that they had, opportunity and so on, which I think is good. A lot of the people I talked to had specific deployment plans rather than just, how big the SAM is and so on.
Yeah.
Rollables and foldables on the phone side were, kind of interesting. Rollables, it's coming off, but, a lot of them you're not able to touch. That tells you something how fragile that is and such. And let's look at my notes here. So obviously there's no metaverse hype, but people were kind of not mentioning metaverse world, but we're talking about XR, VR, AR and stuff like that, which I think really good, and putting it in the right place, and people are talking about right use cases where people can make money rather than just hype that everybody is trying to talk up.
Yeah.
So those are at a very high level in my view. Satcom came, there are a few mentions, and interesting topics, discussions about satellite connectivity on phones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll agree with you on a lot of stuff. I mean, I think the thing that really stood out to me was how Metaverse just died. And you mentioned that. I mean, very few people talked about it. And if you did, it was like, oh, are you serious? Now, that being said, I did attend the keynote, the first keynote, and there was a mention, okay, of Web3, which I don't know if that's worse, but it's obvious that Metaverse didn't survive more than a year before now there's this other pivot, which is Web3. And I just want to, I want to tell our audience, Web3 was the ridiculous part of Metaverse. Okay, you strip out Web3, you get XR, like what you were saying, Prakash. You get the stuff that can actually deliver value are the things that we need to focus on. And I agree with you. The whole the whole feel of the show for me was much more focused on the practical, right? And Earl, to your point about the 5.5G and the 5G advanced, one of the things that I think you heard quite a bit in the conference, and it didn't just come from the Chinese vendors, is that this next phase in 5G is being aggressively driven by the Chinese, and it's not, without merit either. I think what is generally out there, at least in the West, is that somehow the Chinese don't have any game. They do have game. And here's the thing, not only from a technological perspective and engineering standpoint, which I think people should know, but in terms of actually going out there and driving the front end innovation, the industrial innovation using 5G, that, there wasn't a single operator or vendor that didn't recognize that. And I think, as we look forward into this next era and going into 5G, where it may even be a bifurcated situation. I mean, Prakash, I know you do a lot of stuff on the 5G, 3GPP standards related stuff, but you and I have kind of talked about, wow, if we're not careful, the future could be kind of a split. It can go back to being, two technology sets again, right? And so, that was one of the takeaways that I had. A few of the takeaways that I had based off of some of the things that you guys have mentioned already, but I have a ton of other things in my notes. But I don't know, were there any other things that you guys were saying, on the open, in particular the Open RAN front? Because, one of the things that Earl and I have been running for the past couple of months is our series called the RAN to the RIC. So if you haven't tuned in, it's on the neXt Curve YouTube channel. It's a series that we're running that examines the state of Open RAN. So I don't know, Prakash, you've made some comments about how you felt that Open RAN was making traction. What were some of those things that you saw that gave you that impression?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you had actual examples, right? For example, I know Dish and Samsung together making this announcement. They have started deployment and they have planned for 24,000 base stations. Vodafone, I know they keep making announcements and seems to be some progress. They have done deployment. Japan, KDDI and Docomo have done implements. Some of these are even multi-vendor, which we're not seen in the US yet, right? For example, Samsung is working with Fujitsu in Dish, Fujitsu radios, and with NEC radios in Japan. So that's good. And then Verizon is, so the discussion is kind of twofold, right? There's a vRAN traction and Open RAN traction. Open RAN is mostly in greenfield, except for Japan. And vRAN kind of across the board support, like C-band in US is mostly vRAN, virtualized RAN. might be with a single vendor with open interfaces, that's there. And the discussion also on whether you need a L1 accelerator or can go with general compute. I mean, that's a favorite topic of mine. We can go into in detail if you are interested.
You posted about that, right?
And also on 5G Advanced, I think the bigger question around 5G was, okay, we are done the mobile broadband, we have smartphones, penetration going with 5G, but now what do we do? How do we make money with that is the question, right? So a lot of people were wondering that, can 5G Advance help there? Might be. And your point about, and Earl's point about Chinese vendors talking about more, I think because of the industrial base that they have, I think it is natural for them to do it much before any of the US or European vendor, in my view, because they have a ready-made use case and large factories, and very highly digitally transformed, if you will, the enterprise base. So they might actually do it sooner than others. Who knows? But I don't think that will bifurcate the standards and such. Maybe it's just like what happened in 5G. They in large scale deployments they were before than others. I'm also a little bit disappointed that most of those industrial use cases and others, a lot of them did not have them. Whoever had it was basically rehashed demos and messaging from 2 or 3 years ago, right? So, but there were no major industrial IoT demos as such that can be seen with clear use cases in my view. I think that's a big miss.
But Earl, you had the chance to check out the whole mining, the 5G mine thing with Huawei, right?
Yeah, the Debswana, I believe, was the company, and they're in Botswana. They're a diamond mining outfit. And so I think it was interesting from Huawei's perspective to note that I think, and others have mentioned it too, that your IT network is way different than your production equipment network that has all of the drilling equipment and everything else that's fully functioning in the mine itself. How do you get those two to talk to each other becomes a very big challenge, and becomes a lot of custom software to interface between those two networks, right? And your wireless network, whatever it is, 4G or 5G, is going to sit more on the IT side. And how do you get that ability to talk to every one of those pieces of equipment becomes, I think, a bigger challenge, in that equipment set is probably going to be different at every facility and every mining company, depending on what they're using. So it could be very difficult to cookie cutter what could be a template for vertical of mining, as opposed to a vertical for gas and oil exploration or something else. So, and it took Huawei 2 years to figure that out, given all of their resources. So I think that's the key point is who is going to have 2 years times however many verticals and the resources to support that.
Well, that's actually a super interesting statement, because it's sort of reflects the experience that the IoT community has gone through, where they thought that these, sort of, generic, horizontal platforms could somehow make traction and, accelerate the, implementation of IoT solutions. And that hasn't turned out to be the case. In fact, we've seen a lot of the hyperscalers who made their forays into IoT with this horizontal portal approach. Now, literally almost all of them have backed out, or they've sunset and gotten rid of their IoT platforms, right? They're core, whether they call them IoT cores, right? And so I think that's probably what we're going to see on the private network side for industrial. I kind of look at this whole private 5G network discussion as being two-part. There's the enterprise stuff, and then there's the industrial stuff, and you can't assume that they're the same. And on one end, what we saw, one of the big announcements, I think, was, everyone was talking about was, HPE's acquisition of Athonet, right? And the way I look at it, I don't know how you guys feel, but I saw that more of as a sort of quote unquote 5G or cellular private network enterprise play more than it could be an industrial. I think the problem with industrial, and this speaks to your point, Earl, is that these environments are so different, right? And the requirements are so critical as well as demanding that there is going to be no easy button. And, a lot of the folks that have been talking 5G private networks are saying, hey, it needs to be as easy as Wi-Fi. I'm almost like tempted to say, hey, well, go and talk to the Huawei folks. And one of the things that makes Huawei very unique as a company is they have not only, industry leading competencies on the carrier network side, right? So all the cellular stuff, but they're also a pretty big powerhouse on enterprise, right? So they straddle both of these domains, and if it takes 2 years for them to sit there and set up a private network and a solution for one mine, I think there's something to really be observed and examined in that use case, So I don't know how you guys feel or saw that whole private 5G cellular discussion.
I think. Go ahead, Prakash.
Okay, go ahead.
I think just quickly, if you look at ZTE as also having a chance to work with China Mobile, Unicom, Telecom, across shipping, across mines, electrical grids over in China, there's just so many state projects that both of these vendors get an opportunity to work on, as opposed to what could be available outside of China. That they're getting a lot of experience in what works and what doesn't work, that no one else is getting a chance to even participate in. So they're going to be able to learn a lot faster and come up with as close to as what could exist as a cookie cutter from vertical to vertical.
I think that there are two things here, right? There's private networks and there is industrial IoT. So let's look at the private network itself. Private networks, which might a little bit up to industrial IoT as well, that you don't solve the private network challenge by considering it as a public network, right? So your go-to market for a public network is you have this large operators. You go sell it to them once, and selling to each operator is a little bit different, but it is most on the same line. So better feature, capacity, blah blah blah. But in private network, it is different. Selling to each sector is different, and even within that each sector, to each companies is different, right? So, and then I don't think the vendors themselves are well equipped in terms of background, in terms of their go to market, infrastructure that they have for sales, support, and such, to do it on their own. I think the best option is either they partner or collaborate with the folks that already service that market, or be on the background, provide the solutions, and let the system integrators or these industrial players run it, and then they be the supporters or the providers of the solutions equipment to them. I think that's how it would work. Otherwise, currently if you look at many of the vendors, infra vendors, they have huge private networks, business groups trying to sell to these. It is very hard for them to really make a good ROI on all the sales and the support staff that they have in that model, because initially these networks will be small. If you take, for example, enterprise networks, maybe 5-10 sites, and they will, for industrial private networks, it will take for a very long time for them to scale up. Of course, they might be very high value, high revenue growth after that, but for them to see that growth will take a lot of time. So if they have large teams right now exploring the private networks, I don't think that's the best approach in my view, right? And in terms of enterprises, it should be more, a lot of times the enterprise or this private networks and industrial IoT, is thought to be okay when we have URLLC and other things, we'll start utilizing them. But even with the current mobile broadband, there are a lot of opportunities with the deterministic connection that 5G and cellular can provide compared to Wi-Fi. There are a lot of opportunities for private networks and industrial IoT. So that's at a very high level. So to summarize, it may or may not be, in my view, only a vendor challenge or operator challenge. It is more of a how you have a good mix of people who have right background to address this, right? So, and it is not, we don't have to wait for all these fancy things like URLLC to be effective, to make it work. Even with broadband can start. And if I might add, I mean, Ericsson long back, I think maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, did a similar project with Rio Tinto, maybe. I don't remember, but in Brazil for a mining project, how private networks could use. So private network talk is not new. It's been going on for a long time and we're still talking.
Oh,
right?
yeah. I mean, in fact, a lot of these, I mean, this is maybe like 12, 13 years ago. I mean, this whole idea of an autonomous mine was quite old. It had been around for a while. And so, I mean, a lot has changed. Obviously, with these newer generations, let's say, of autonomous mines, they're trying to infuse more connected capabilities into them. How that manifests itself, obviously, is something that's going to be specific to however they're designing the overall systems that go into these mines. And so I think this goes back to Earl, what you were talking about, that these are long projects. The environments that you're dealing with as an implementer are going to be diverse across. They're going to be different. They're just not going to be the same. And I think you're making a great point, Prakash, in pointing out the role of the SI or the systems integrator. And that's the thing that the IoT community is slowly coming to the realization, is that you can't just think about providing an easy button or tools and stuff like that. That's exactly what you said, Prakash. That's low margin, marginal value stuff in the grand scheme of things. It's like the real value comes from people who can go and look at an environment, assess what it will take to actually deliver a solution, consider all the technologies and the actual system that you have to deal with, and how connectivity factors in enabling whatever that aspirational or target solution is going to look like and how it's going to operate. And that's going to take a lot. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to bridge. And that's why I think, my take is over the next couple of years, there's going to be this very similar journey that the 5G cellular private cellular community is going to face, that the community faced. Right, it's almost exactly the same, and so it'll be interesting to see how this year pans out. But I think there's gonna be a lot of sobering moments. Let's put it that way, because from what I could tell, most of the private 5G/LTE, you can just call it cellular network projects, are largely in POC. They're very few that are making scale. And when we consider what's happening with Wi-Fi, especially on the enterprise front. I mean, Prakash, you and I are on calls with Qualcomm quite a bit. Big question is, how does cellular, whether it's LTE or 5G, differentiate itself in the enterprise context, going forward, right? And that, I think that's another big factor that needs to be considered, right? So,
hey, Leonard, for mobility is basically for private cellular is, if the use cases have mobile mobility, seamless mobility, and needs handoff and so on, and if it is outdoor, which needs expansive coverage, right? So those are the two critical things, and low latency whenever it is available on cellular, extremely low latency, not regular, or right now a deterministic connection, right? So the needs are known. The use cases are somewhat known. If there is use case needs these three things, then you need cellular or Wi-Fi cannot do it. But there are not many ways where these are being implemented. There are some use cases which are getting traction, but it is not a wholesale solution that you can apply anywhere, right? So it is not a easy solution. Oh, I take, I have cellular knowledge and solutions. I can apply it anywhere with a broad brush, right? So it has to be very well thought out because it is expensive to even deploy and manage later. So it is that's the reason I'm thinking you need somebody who needs domain knowledge for that specific segment, who understands that segment better to solve this, rather than somebody who has connectivity and 5G knowledge trying to solve that, because the gap is too much for them to learn in terms of skills and the domain knowledge and so on.
Yeah. Earl, you were
Leonard, I think the one thing to make sure that our audience understands when we talk about private networks is certainly in the US, there's spectrum available that is unlicensed, right? That you don't have to pay for. But everywhere else in the world, the role of the operator becomes extremely key, specifically in China for all of these projects. Because at the end of the day, what is the monetization going to be, and will it look like for each of the stakeholders? The OEM gets to sell his equipment. Are they selling analytics software along with that? The operator gets to lease their spectrum, right, that they're going to get paid for, and however many eSIMs they're going to tack onto these devices or whatever that is running off of that network using that band or multiple frequency bands. So that's going to be a much different and more complicated situation than maybe in the US market, where we have CBR spectrum, if we're talking private LTE networks initially, to where the operator doesn't get involved, right?
True. I think that's a good distinction. It's very regional as well. I mean, China, the market is so structured, looks like, because government controls most of the things. Most of the private networks will be managed, deployed, operated by operators. If you go to Europe, especially in Germany, there is a dedicated private network spectrum, so it will be independent entities, these large industrial houses, which will manage it. And you come to US, it's a mishmash. Nobody knows really. There is a lightly licensed spectrum. I won't call it unlicensed CBRS. That is lightly licensed. And if you're looking at mining or large factories with their own township and so on, spectrum interference can be managed, because probably if you take a large township, they are the only one using CBRS, then it can be managed that way. But US is still, I think, a step behind Europe and China in terms of industrial private networks, if I can make that statement. And how it'll roll out, I think, still is an open question, whether operators will drive it or the private entities. I think it's still an open question.
And there's still a huge unknown about India at this point. I'm assuming it's going to be similar to the other countries and not like the US, where the operator is going to get involved unless there is spectrum that's specifically allocated for private networks as part of what they were auctioned off for the 5G spectrum.
Another good point. Actually, there is a big industrial house called Adani's. They actually they bought some part of the spectrum, and they have explicitly mentioned that they have bought it for industrial private networks, right? These are, this is a huge industrial conglomerate with interest in petrochemicals, with shipping, with textiles, and many industries. So it could be, I think, 5G, India is still looking at deploying broadband. I think it's an open question. Both the options are open right now. Operators are still preoccupied with getting their public networks up and running. And at least one operator has good capital structure like Geo to do more than regular public networks. But others, Airtel, if you look at, or Vodafone, I don't think they have the financial wherewithal to do much more beyond what they're doing with their regular broadband network. So we'll see how that goes. I think it's an open question. I agree with Earl on that.
So, hey guys, I have a question for you both, because one of the things that we heard about quite a bit, I mean, this is a theme from last year, but I guess they kicked the can down the road again for this year. But it's on the topic of monetization. We hear about 5G monetization and the need for it. And what were your impressions? I mean, what did you... have we made any progress on that conversation, or do you think it's still sort of this theoretical, sticking point for the advancement of 5G? What did you guys see, and what do you guys think?
That's a tough one, Leonard. I think if we look at it from a consumer perspective, I don't think there's any monetization that's going to be available to the operator at this point, unless there's some new service that someone's willing to pay for. And we haven't seen any new service come out. And again, we talked about this at the show. Most of the consumers who are getting a 5G handset are not getting it because it has 5G. They're getting it because of something else. And it just happens to be 5G enabled. So if their primary reason for upgrading their handset is not to get the latest air interface technology, then that doesn't bode well, obviously, for the operator that's selling that phone.
Yeah. Now, what about you?
To add to that, most of them getting a 5G handset, because they have to. Otherwise, if I want to buy a premium 4G handset, it's not out there in US, for example, right? So yeah. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I think, no, I agree with you. I think maybe the one area that everyone's now climbing on the same tree limb is maybe fixed wireless access.
Wireless access, correct.
Right? Yeah. That's the only potentially low-hanging fruit that's out there. But how low is it? I'm not really sure. And how costly is it going to be to actually roll it out and to have it be effective on a per sector basis? Becomes one of those unknowns, because we do know that in 4G land, it was somewhat difficult to get that deployed. And we know from Verizon's efforts in millimeter wave, it really hasn't been successful. So now how does one do it in sub 6 gig, or a combination of sub 6 gig and millimeter wave to actually have an effective network and to be able to get some type of ROI for deploying that?
Yeah. And, I think, the sub 6 plus millimeter wave, I think that's the big opportunity, right? And if we look at this effort to densify the network with millimeter wave, or at least make it more of a useful spectrum for a lot of operators, that's probably one of the things that is going to be, let's put it this way, it could be a potential bright spot. One of the things I did here at the conference was FWA, though it may not be as big as a huge thing as some folks might think, it actually is a thing, right? I mean, in terms of enhancing revenues, although it may not be massive, it's consumer oriented, actually also SMB oriented, and it provides operators with new avenues for not only making additional revenue beyond what their the smartphone subs that they have, but it also helps them to utilize their spectrum assets better. And then also the infrastructure, because the traffic patterns during the day for mobile, there could be complements with the traffic patterns for FWA, right? And so, to your point, Earl, I think it's something that will have to be vetted. There's going to be a lot of learning, but baseline, there is additional value there And I think that's a positive. Do you know what I'm saying? And there's some folks out there that are trashing FWA, and it's like, look, you know what? Okay, it may not be this incredible killer app, but you know what? It's something, you know?
Right. But I guess the issue to make sure everyone's aware of is the mobile guys are not just competing against the cable companies here in the US, right? You have a bunch, as in the rest of the world, you have a bunch of WISP that already have the entry-level broadband wireless connections and provide FWA services. So you already have an incumbent there that the mobile guy is trying to switch out of. And then does it get to be a price war between the WISP that's in that rural marketplace that T-Mo or someone else wants to take over, or between the cable guy that's an incumbent where the mobile guy wants to take over their subs, right? And they just kill each other. And as long as you're selling the hardware, then you're okay. But at what point, do we end up, the consumer ends up winning, but I don't know if we're going to see any real monetization or real profitability from the different operators.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at 5G network, right, other than the bump operators have gotten with higher unlimited plans, fixed wireless access is the only new revenue stream that they have seen. And I mean, if you're looking at US, for example, each of them have like close to 160, 170 megahertz, sometimes in 190 megahertz of mid-band spectrum that they have gotten. So that's lots of capacity in the network, right? So, and unless there is another killer app that will use that capacity in the mobile, it's idle capacity and they're making best use of it, right? So, and I think, I mean, if you look at the projections of the operators in the US, they should have enough capacity to go, even if they sell fixed wireless the way they expect it to, till at least end of next year. So only after next year, they look at, okay, do we have more spectrum? Do we need more spectrum or utilize mid-band spectrum for that use, right? That's one point. And second point is, initial fixed wireless has been really great because of two reasons. One, the networks are almost empty, so speeds are much higher than what they're promised, right? If you look at some of the Ookla and the open signal numbers, the people are getting 300 Mbps wherever the promised speed is 150 Mbps, 100 to 150 Mbps, right? So that's the reason they're really happy. But will they be same? Will that be same, or their happiness level remains the same when they have lots of people with fixed wireless access using the network and the speed comes down from 300 to 150? We'll see that. That is point number one. Point number two is right now, cable guys, we're not seeing that as a threat, but that has changed. If you look at the response from the cable guys in last 3 or 4 months, everybody is basically either running ads trashing fixed wireless access versus cable, or they are deploying their own fixed wireless access, or doing both, right? So there will be a lot of competition very soon in that. And then cable pricing hasn't budged in last couple of years, if you look at it. But which means cable guys have enough margin there to cut to be more competitive with fixed wireless access. So we'll see the real fight end of this year, early next year for fixed wireless access, in my view. So probably the situation is similar outside the US as well. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing, I think there's this notion that fixed wireless access is for rural, but I think there's plenty of applications for more densely populated areas, right? It all depends on the maturity of the fiber. I mean, the fiber footprint and the maturity of the networks. That I think is what really determines what the value of a tool. I call it kind of a tool, right? It's an alternative. Hey, it's another tool in your toolkit, and if you're trying to connect somebody, it's another thing that you can consider as an option in providing access to a consumer. But like what you're saying, Prakash, people try to make it some sort of tech war, or you know what I'm saying? It's like, look, no. Just treat it like a tool. It's something that you can leverage if it makes sense. And, but I suppose we're going to see how all this plays out. But Earl, I agree with you. There's going to be a learning curve. People are going to learn. There's going to be market dynamics that play out that probably dispel or restructure some expectations or assumptions. But from what I heard and what I saw, I think that was the only monetization bright spot.
Right. But again, to maybe cast some shadows on that bright spot, if we look at Starry and its recent bankruptcy, and it had a fairly decent business model of not trying to beam through all the windows that Verizon was trying to do at street level, right? And to go rooftop to rooftop and then distribute the signal from the rooftop down. And it still hasn't been able to get the users. So what is it, at the end of the day, what is it going to take to win over a consumer is the $1 billion question for the industry, right? Because they're just not budging for whatever reason.
You know what? I think Prakash actually invented and came up with it. It's called happiness. You're a genius, Prakash. I don't know if you know this or not. that was, instead of having a friggin' coverage map and then it sits there and says, hey, you have 5G here and there, the operator that has the biggest cojones is going to put out a happiness map. How happy are your customers with the service that you provide?
I think at this point, that is probably an important thing, because if you're happy, you're not going to churn, right?
Right. But,
even if you save a lot of money, people are not going to want to go through the effort, because it's a pain in the ass to try to switch back and forth just to save a few bucks every other month, right? At the end of the day, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Correct. And cable guys have been there, monopoly, right? Not even virtual monopoly, actual monopoly in most of the markets.
Yeah.
And they did not have any incentive to keep their customers happy, right? So now there is, new kid in town offering better service. If you look at the scores, cellular operators are not very high, but they are higher than cable for sure, right? So it's all relative right now. And then with being a wireless networks, there are much fewer hassles compared to a cable, in my view, in terms of bringing that happiness to consumers. So we will see.
Well, you still have to bring it inside your home, though, and that's not an easy challenge depending on where you're at. So I think there's still some issues in how do I pipe it inside a home, and if it's multi-story with a basement or whatever, you're still going to have a solution that's not a simple, easy one than going through a window and I have internet somewhere on the main floor of a house.
I agree. So one thing I should admire operators is that cellular operators is that they are a little bit careful on how and who they sell, where they sell this service.
Yeah.
Right. So they are taking time to slowly, because they know that's another challenge as well. If you look at in US, especially, probably true everywhere else as well, is 5G networks are mostly in urban and dense urban areas where it's mostly a coverage build. And so the coverage could be pretty okay. But as they move out into suburbs using C-band in US, which is using 1900 site grid, there will be coverage challenges, and how they address, I think, will be key as well. So that will also affect the happiness factor, if you will.
Happiness. It's all about happiness. See, GSMA should adopt that next year, they say.
Yeah, that could be next theme, right? I mean, this year's was velocity, which is pretty abstract. Next would be happiness.
Well, I mean, did either of you guys see velocity anywhere in the Fira?
No, that's another
certainly not in the taxi stands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not. Wow, it was pretty crowded this year,
Yeah.
actually. It could have been worse. I remember in the heyday, it was really bad. You couldn't get anywhere. But
Yeah, I think there are two things that I saw improvement, right? Even with 80,000. One, they digitized the badge, so the line for badge when you get out of the airport, 1 hour of wait was eliminated, which is really good.
uh,
And then maybe, I mean, I used metro most of the time, so taxi was not that bad a deal this year. I don't know how you guys felt.
yeah, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying in the heyday, it would take you like an hour and a half to get out. But traffic in downtown was kind of nasty sometimes. But hey, so the other thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is let's go back to the RAN. So one of my observations was this: it's becoming less about Open RAN. It's more about like 50 shades of what I've kind of dubbed 50 shades of Cloud RAN. You can call it vRAN if you want, but I mean, I think it's pretty obvious everyone's trying to move toward more of a cloud native architecture and promoting that across the different RAN elements. But that I think is where a lot of the conversation is going, where a lot of the focus is going, and where I think a lot of the bets are going now. I honestly heard less about Open RAN than I did vRAN, and obviously, we have Intel. They announced their fourth gen Xeon scalable processor. These guys basically are the staple, right, of vRAN, and I didn't even hear them talk about Open RAN as much. They're really emphasizing vRAN, vRAN, vRAN. That being the larger common denominator, or being the common denominator of all the stuff that we're talking about here. So I don't know. What do you guys think? And also, I want to get your takes on like any RAN. What Ericsson's doing with Cloud RAN at the SMO level. I mean, looking at the whole stack of the RAN, what did you guys think?
I think if you look at anything that's trying to get to the cloud is going to require an immense amount of fiber, right? So then the question becomes, how many of these operators have allocated whatever CapEx or OpEx that they need to have enough pipes or have enough big pipes of fiber going to all of their sites to be able to do what looks easy on paper, but never resulted in any momentum in CRAN when we first talked about it, because a lot of the operators just didn't have the fiber. So we still have a distributed RAN architecture. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be that way for quite some time, just because of where the sites are located. And the fact that if you're trying to get to 20 kilometers or more, it's really not going to be effective. And then that brings up the question of how far can you be to have vRAN work from wherever you're hosting that CU or DU or virtual CU DU. So I think that's, I don't know if that's solved or where we're at in terms of that technology, but certainly, again, that's not really Open RAN. And if we're talking about cloud, then we're talking about vRAN. We're not talking about Open RAN.
Yeah, you're talking about disaggregated architectures, and then the placement of the compute, and
right, but it's not open.
Correct.
No, it doesn't need to be open. It's just disaggregated in cloud.
Yes.
Cloud,
So there are three levels, right? First is disaggregation, right? So instead of having a BBU and radio unit, you have a DU, CU, DU radio unit, right? That is kind of disaggregation. And part of that is virtualization as well. And then, when you're doing it, making it cloud native. So at least in the US, it will still be distributed. It could be DUs instead of BBU at a base station, which means they have cloud interfaces, cloud architecture, but it will not be like a centralized in the old, terminology, basement hotels with only fibers running to RUs everywhere, right? I think at least US is not going to be that, other than some very dense urban areas in maybe Manhattan, New York areas, in the Los Angeles and Bay Area, and sometimes. Other than that, it is pretty distributed. So you'll still have not non data center deployment in RAN. They are called data center deployments of RAN. I don't think data center deployments will be very valid in the US, at least. It'll still be distributed, but you will have VU, VCU, and VDU with disaggregated software and hardware, and then with open interfaces. So the first step, other than few exceptions, will always be single vendor first, disaggregated, virtualized RAN, vRAN, because that is the reason everybody's talking, because that is the first step, and that is kind of a given that any new deployments that will happen from now on will be of that sort, right? That is one. And the next step would be then you basically, for example, if you're looking at 5G Advanced, you want to expand your coverage and services, then whether you can bring in RUs and from other vendors and integrate. So can you do a multi-vendor? Can you do a mix and match at the second phase or second wave of 5G? Then you can bid vendors against each other so that you get better pricing, right? Right now, usually the RAN model works is you get a foot in with the first tender, right? With very attractive pricing. When the time comes to expand for newer features and the network, then you say, hey, you already logged in that this is where I make my money, right? For vendors. The hope is since they are doing virtual RAN with open interfaces, hopefully, making them easier to mix and match with open RAN multi-vendor at a second wave or second phase, right? We will see how that turns out, but at least that's the hope.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I personally don't think that single vendor is as important as single throat to choke, packaged, tested, and ready to go. That's probably more important. And that may not necessarily be a single vendor. It may be a few vendors. So going back to, this term that, I coined a couple of years ago, the Squid Game. That's what the Squid Game's all about, right? Is you're selective about who you partner with, you package the stuff, you optimize it, you go to market, and you present yourself as a X+1, X+3 or 2 player. And then that is the winning solution. The impression I got is the whole open discussion has been such a distraction from that, that it's led many of the Open RAN players to seek the harder problem of making multiple vendor products interoperable rather than focusing on what's actually going to make them a viable competitor, right? So a lot of energy has been put into that interoperability stuff and, sort of this ecosystem kumbaya instead of actually competing. And I think that's been the big problem. And that's why I said this year is the year of Squid Game, whether you like it or not, because otherwise you're not going to be around.
I have different opinion.
No, it's good. It's good.
I think the disaggregation and virtualization gives you tools to make it open. Do you do all the 3 steps in one go? Disaggregation, virtualization, and open. That is, I think, too much stuff to chew in one step, especially for operators who are very risk averse. So the two can happen in one step, which I think they are doing right now. And third, the hope is you are keeping the interfaces open. So the third point, the second step of multi-vendor could become a possibility if you
Yeah.
want to do it at a later stage, right? So
Which is
that's how I think the things are playing out in my view.
Which is why I think what Samsung is doing is smart, and probably why they're making more traction than others, right?
Yeah, I mean, and then also they were the front runners because they did not have any sacred cows to sacrifice, right, to get into virtual RAN. They were disruptors, whereas Huawei has not even talked about it.
No,
Nokia was the first one to adopt among the established players because they had the least market share and they thought this could give them a leg up.
no.
Ericsson had the large market share, and they were the last one to adopt it. And they don't even have good deployments right now to talk about. They keep talking about Cloud RAN, right? For good reasons, right?
But I think their fallback is the SMO and their RIC
For
offering.
private networks, and they said they've signed, they announced something with Verizon, but I don't know what is the size of the deployment right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Leonard, on this whole, just to again have a reality check on what's happening in Open RAN. If I don't know if you guys saw this, but within the Ericsson booth, they had a very big display that talked about the RAN compute evolution story. So in 2017, the first 5G narrowband baseband unit that they had could support 24 cells. And then in 2021, they released a new generation, 48 cells. And now in 2044, next year, they're hoping to release a baseband unit or RAN compute unit that will support 300 cells. So that's a substantial increase, yet the form factor has stayed a 1U height, 19-inch rack-mounted unit because of the silicon that's continued to evolve within their own purpose-built silicon, as opposed to what's happening with a lot of the servers. So granted that Intel has their 4th gen, I think at this point, anyone who wants to have a server and anyone else's card is going to have to figure out, how do I write the software? And do I just choose one vendor for that card? Because each card needs a different set of software now. And how much resources am I going to have as a server guy to support all of these different chip vendors' cards, whether it's Qualcomm, Marvell, or whoever else? Or do they just decide maybe it's easier to go with Intel, or maybe it isn't easier to go with Intel?
Yeah. That goes back to the discussion about my favorite subject, which is accelerators versus general compute. So, I mean, I talked to some of the, Verizon, Nokia, Samsung, and few others. They kind of realized the importance of it, that their software has to be portable across platforms, across these radio players, as well as across, even if you go to a higher layer 2, layer 3, it has to be portable across Xeon, Intel's offerings versus AMD, for example, for servers. And not only that, across x86 and ARM, right? So they are cognizant of the fact that doesn't mean their software is portable. They still need some work to port it across these platforms. But it gives me it's good to know that they understand that issue and making sure their software is as much abstracted as it can from the underlying compute hardware architecture, right? So that is the good news. But the bad news is it still needs work, right? Which I think Earl pointed out, which means, I mean, this kumbaya of, I just like computer, I can bring any processor, I can get any Windows and run on it. It is not that easy in a telecom network, right?
And all that costs money, right? I mean, Prakash, to your point, I mean, that's why I think maybe next year, I know that Open RAN Squid Game kind of made some traction this year in terms of people knowing about it. But I think it's gonna be a big thing next year, this year as well as next year. It just cannot be this complex, because I think what we're looking at is complexity that is getting in the way of scalability and then ultimately viability for a lot of players out in the market. And you guys are bringing up some excellent questions. And, it's good that we don't agree, because at the intersection of disagreement, I think there's a lot of great insight that our audience can glean off of our discussion. So, hey, we're going to have to wrap this up. I know there's a ton more that each of us probably wanted to share, but too bad. You're going to have to jump on at some other point, and we'll continue our discussions, because, these are topics and themes that are going to continue to vex us through the course of this year as well as in the near future. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me in this MWC 2023 recap. I had a great time with you guys. I'm looking forward to next year. And I want to give you both an opportunity to plug your individual research firms. And for those of you out there, you guys have to follow these two gentlemen. Earl is just a friggin' beast. And,
and criminal.
Yeah, he's criminal. And, actually, Prakash is kind of like a criminal in his own right as well. He's wonderful because on all of our analyst calls, he asks, number one, the most questions. And then I'm doing what you do, Prakash. And number two, he asks the best questions. Technical, well-informed. And so if you guys want to know where the tide of 5G is going to be going, and how high or low it's going to ebb and flow, these two gentlemen are great folks to follow and keep an eye out on. Okay. And so, hey, Prakash, why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. If you want to know more about my work, check out my website, tantraanalyst.com, and my podcast, Tantra's Mantra. And it's always been great talking to Leonard. I mean, I think our discussions go, at least my discussions go a level up when I'm on your show, Leonard. Yes. So thanks for being that up. Yeah,
you're more than welcome. Yeah,
giving you a plug there. Thanks.
Thanks. Earl, you're up, man.
So basically, www.ejlwireless.com. And you can check out the latest radios I'm ripping apart, thoughts that I have, or whatever is out there. You can probably see it on LinkedIn just as well as on the website. And thanks, Leonard, for having me on again.
Absolutely. And for all of you who have tuned in, thank you so much. I just want to clarify that it is my job to tame these two gentlemen, and make sure that they don't get into trouble. Okay. And really appreciate you again tuning in, and look forward to providing you with a recap of MWC 2024. I can only assume all of us are going to be there again. It was a great event, and congratulations to GSMA for being back in true form. And unadulterated form. Congratulations. And please follow NextCurve at www.next-curve.com. And I have a newsletter on LinkedIn, which is on fire now. So go check out my profile and subscribe. And I'll have links to these gentlemen as well. So, we're all trying to help each other out here. And, spread the love, and knowledge. And also make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, which is the NextCurve reThink reThink YouTube channel. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.